I find it kind of ironic and honestly a little bit funny that while we're actually reading Elbaf, what you should be taking away from it is that Loki is a despicable guy. His catchphrase is literally, I'm going to destroy the world. It's his version of I want to be king of the pirates. Needless to say, the giants of Elbaf absolutely despise him, and they literally refer to him as the accursed prince and the shame of Elbaf. But if you've been here long enough, you should realize that nothing is more important than agenda. One Piece fans laugh in the face of facts. So while Loki is overtly one of the most evil characters in the entire series, of course, the One Piece fans are looking for any way possible in order to justify him. Hashtag Loki did nothing wrong. Face it, Oda, we want him to be the good guy in disguise. But look guys, hate it or love it, we're living in this universe and I'm with it. So let me present to you a crazy conspiracy that'll leave you wondering whether or not Loki actually killed his own father. Or if he did, why he is not entirely to blame. Strap yourselves in, tinfoil securely on, let's begin. Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, just to make sure that we say it, fans have legitimate reasons to believe that Loki is not as evil as he appears to be. In a conversation that Loki had with Mosa, or in the Viz translations, Shaggy, Mosa plants a seedling of doubt. Mosa says, you use harsh words, but there's a streak of kindness beneath the surface. I've noticed that more and more recently. And this checks out with other contexts that we see with Loki. While he says one thing, it does seem like he genuinely cares about his friends, specifically the animals of the land of the dead. We're told directly that he would be sad if they died. It even feels like Shamrock senses this because he attempts to use them to manipulate Loki. And I guess in reality, it's all just kind of sad, because really the only friends that Loki has are those that have been abandoned by Elbaf. The actual giants hate him, and they have pretty much since the moment that he was born. And it's not even his fault. A prophecy was made before he was born that King Harold would be killed by his own son, and people just already knew that Loki would do that and judged him for it. What makes this even more unfair is that Loki is not even the eldest son of King Harold. Hyrrodin is older, but because Hyrrodin is born of impure blood, and you can just look at Hyrrodin's size in comparison to other large giants, he's just smaller. And I guess the giants of Elbaf collectively decided that there was no way that Hyrrodin would be able to kill King Harold, who was noted to have a lot of ancient giant blood and was just larger than other giants, similar to Elder Jarul and Jorl. The only one who could do that would be the pureblood son Loki. But I'm over here like, Hyrrodin could have done it as well. You could have waited to judge each person's character, you know? Instead, the island of Elbaf effectively made Loki who he is today. At the same time, it's likely that Loki fit many of the signs of the Nika prophecy in Elbaf. Nika, or the sun god, who the giants are not entirely sure will be a savior to the world or destroy it. Naturally, Loki has chosen this destruction angle. But it's a legitimate question whether or not this is who Loki actually is, or if he may have to pretend a little bit. Loki from Norse mythology is the trickster god. He is chaos incarnate, but he's not entirely evil. The Marvel Cinematic Universe really captures this. The best way to describe the iconic character of Loki is he is complicated, and I expect Oda to do something similar in the story of One Piece. In fact, the more overtly cliche that Loki pretends to be straight up evil incarnate, the less that I believe it. Look, Oda, my man, I apologize, I am sorry. Anyone who calls celestial dragons scum to their face has redeemed themselves somewhat in my eyes. So is Loki actually capable of killing his own father? I am not entirely sure. And just look guys, Luffy can absolutely be tricked, but he also tends to be a very good judge of character. Think about all the times that he's been tricked before. Whiskey Peak, Vivi, Pudding, Usopp as Sogeking. Might also throw in Nami here, Foxy. I might be missing some examples, but you get the point. While Luffy can be tricked, the people that are capable of deceiving him tend to be good people, or have a cause that is just. This even applies to a guy like Kanjuro. It's as though Luffy can read their souls. Not a coincidence that they most often end up becoming allies. And so with Loki being beaten to an inch of his life, the Strat's in position possibly to save his life. This is tracking in this way. As it turns out, in the real world throughout history, most villains have to see themselves as the hero. I kinda think the same of Loki. If Loki killed Harold, he would need a very good reason. This is probably just a weird aside, but I'm gonna throw it in anyway. Ichiro Oda is an absolute paralleling god. At any point in time, any one thing could be paralleled with any number of other things. At this point, it's just how his brain works. But his storytelling invites comparison. intentionally. So it's curious to me that Oda spent a few chapters focusing on Robin's flashback, not just because the reunion with Saul was heartfelt and emotional, but how it also potentially relates to Loki. Loki and Robin actually have essentially the same backstory. Even before she was labeled the demon child by the world government, even the people of Ohara thought that she was a monster. Her mother was also not in her life. Everyone around them hated them for reasons that they could not control. And in the mini flashback, you can see how profoundly this affected child Robin. And as she grew into adulthood, we also know that Robin gravitated towards her more darker side in order to survive. But yeah, it's implied that Jaguar D. Saul essentially saved her life, with a small part to play for Nico Olvia as well. All she ever wanted was friends and family, and Saul promised to her that one day she would find them. This promise is what kept her going. I expect that there is something similar in Loki's story. Even as he takes the time to have a conversation with Mosa, you kind of get the feeling Loki might be desperate for friends. And I guess I have an idea for how Loki might have intended to acquire more friends. One thing I think everyone can agree with Luffy is Luffy makes a lot of friends. Our rubber boy is insanely likable. We also know that Luffy is the sun god Nika, the same sun god Nika that Loki wants to be and believes himself to be. So look, speculative or not, I think that it is fair to assume that there might be some prophecy out there somewhere that the sun god Nika is destined to make a lot of friends. We may actually be discussing the very reason why Loki desires to become the sun god Nika. He may not have had Jaguar D. Saul, but these prophecies could have acted as a promise for a better future. And the same as Robin given him a reason to live. But yeah, guys, this is not just the story of Robin and of Loki. You can also look at Big Mom as well. Big Mom was hated and feared from essentially the moment that she was born because of her freakish strength. At every turn, she was abandoned or betrayed. And just the same, this may have inspired her to want to have friends, which is kind of central to the events of Whole Cake Island and Big Mom's entire story. In all honesty, the only place that Big Mom ever found friends without manipulation was in Elbaf, because the children there were her size, so they did not fear her. From the age of 5 to the present story, Big Mom has held on to this hope of potentially returning to Elbaf or finding Mother Carmel. Based on what we have already said, she might have needed to believe this in order to carry on. So I guess what Oda is suggesting is those that want friends the most probably have the most difficulty making them. And this could tell us something about Loki. But I suppose it is officially time to delve into the conspiracy. And I'm just gonna let the cat out of the bad guys right from the jump. I think the central character in all of this is Elder Jarul. I think that it is entirely possible that Elder Jarul betrayed Elbaf and betrayed King Harold. Just hear me out before you judge. In Elbaf, King Harold is said to be their strongest king, a man who fundamentally changed Elbaf's warrior culture and attempted to form peaceful bonds with the outside world. Basically, the Elbaf of today is very different from the Elbaf of the past. They now condemn violence and aggression in all of its forms. In all honesty, this is a pretty crazy feat. The way that I imagine it in my head is that by at least his adulthood, King Harold was a pacifist who could not actually be violent and fight people. So he changed the warriors' worldview by moving their hearts. His enemies would attack him and he would just take it. And he would always get back up, to the point that they lost their will to actually fight him. So he would win every single battle without actually fighting. Honestly, I'm expecting a vibe similar to Whitebeard and Squirtle in Marineford. Squirtle stabbed Whitebeard in the back, and Whitebeard's response was to say, "I still love you." How can you hate a man like that? But just because the country's culture changed doesn't mean that everyone there agreed with it. And I think that Elder Jarul is one of these people. The very first time we met him, 60 years before the present in Big Mom's flashback, Elder Jarul expressed the view that Elbaf must not forget that they are warriors. In fact, he even mentions Carmel's ideas about trade over plunder, ideas which clearly inspired King Harold. And Ripley confirms this beyond a shadow of a doubt. She says, "Seek trade with other nations, not wage war. Our beloved late King Harold said these wise words." And he often clashed with all of the graybeards of the villages. The graybeards here, I'm assuming, is referring to older giants, like Jarl, who didn't agree with these new ideas. The fact is that Jarl represents the old warrior ways and dominated as a pirate in the New World for hundreds of years. If you really sit down and think about it, it's crazy. Jarl and Jorl and the giant warrior pirates were probably the equivalent of Yonko or maybe even Pirate King level for multiple centuries. And as they ruled over the New World, they probably were not beloved by everybody. I think it can't be forgotten that the Giants of Elbaf have a reputation around the world for savagery. And we actually have a quote from Jaguar D. Saul to Child Robin during her flashback. It was like important for Saul to say this. Let me make one thing clear. Don't let me in with the savages of Elbaf. They're the most famous, so of course the entire world believes all giants are like them, but there are gentle giants too. It seems pretty clear to me that Jarl and his brother Jorl most probably contributed to the reputation of Elbaf. As pirates, they were savages. So while he seems old and kindly now, we should be asking some questions about who Jarl really is, what kind of person or what kind of giant he is. And I suppose this leads into another question. Right now we know that there is a faction of giants in Elbaf who seem to look down on humans. We see this with Rode and we see this with Loki. Loki, when talking to the humans present in the land of the dead, said the same fate is in store for any puny humans who dare to defy Elbaf. Your only salvation from being devoured is to dress yourself in putrid smelling clothes to live and serve as a walking corpse. So yeah, yikes. And if we're completely honest, there isn't just a faction of giants in Elbaf who look down on humans, there's a faction of giants in Elbaf who look down on other giants. As it turns out, the giants of Elbaf are historically very bigoted, and we learned in chapter 1137 that they care a lot about their pure Elbaf bloodline. And we've made a theory that the giants of Elbaf are descended from celestial dragon type gods in the past. All of this also relates to the borders of Elbaf being closed. Intruders are not allowed. It seems telegraphed that many forces from around the world desire to possess the island of Elbaf and the Atom Tree. This could be pirate crews, it could be the world government, it could be other factions of giants, but the end result is the same either way. Strength in war has been important to the giants of Elbaf in order for them to protect their own country. And I think that a lot of these fears are justified. They're actually being realized in real time with the presence of Figurlin Shamrock. If the giants of Elbaf are not strong enough, they will lose their home. So King Harald's ideology quite possibly, even realistically, dooms their entire country. So like it or not, some of this bigotry may be required to keep everybody else at arm's distance. And this is actually another thing which is played out in the story. The giants opened their hearts and their homes to Mother Carmel, who went on to sell giants to the world government. Not that they actually know that this occurred, but it did. Really, you can honestly sit here and say maybe they should have been a little bit more bigoted and mistrusting. Crazy but true. So things are the way that they were for a reason. And I believe that this accurately reflects Jarl's opinion. It could even be deeply personal to him. Jarl is one of the giants of Elbaf that we are aware of who have the most reason to resent outsiders. Big Mom, a human at the age of 5, killed his brother Jarl, which he describes as an unforgivable crime because a warrior is defined not by how they live, but by how they die. I would guess the moral of the story here, at least to him, is this is why outsiders cannot be trusted. Opening the borders would be an ill omen, and inviting Elbaf's own destruction. So needless to say, there is a reason for Jarl to disagree with King Harald, and fear the world the king was trying to create. Also at the same time, by condemning violence, Harald was condemning Jarl and Jarl's entire lives and legacy, which would reasonably be an attack on Jarl's pride, which is something that we know that the giants of Elbaf absolutely fight each other about. Everything is about pride. Dori and Brogi were willing to kill each other over who caught the larger Sea King. So if King Harald was telling Jarl that he lived his entire life wrong, and honestly his dead brother as well, their lives were both a waste. In fact, their actions have hurt the country of Elbaf. It would seem to me to be fighting words. But of course, Jarl was an old man. There's little chance that he would actually be able to kill him, but I'm fairly certain that he had reason to resent him. And that, my friends, is what we call a motive in this murder mystery. The honest truth is that before Elbaf, you couldn't even make a theory like this because of our impression of the giants of Elbaf. Through Dori and Brogi and others, we got the impression they're very straightforward people. It would have been hard to believe that they were even capable of deceit, but I suppose now we know better. And that's kind of been a focal point for the story so far at the beginning of Elbaf. The giants as a whole may not be as honorable as we first thought. In fact, they're just like humans. So since Oda is giving this to us, I'm leaning into it. All of this being said, we have established a motive for Jarl to want King Harald dead, and also established that Jarl would be unable to kill King Harald himself, because dude is 400 years old. But fortunately for Jarl, he would already have some belief or hope that he would never need to kill King Harald, because it was already prophesized that King Harald's son would do this instead. In my mind, Loki could have been Jarl's champion, and it's reasonable to believe that Jarl may have encouraged Loki to attempt to kill the king. I kind of hate believing Jarl to be this sort of evil mastermind behind the curtain, but he may have made Loki, and may have groomed him to become a king slayer. How exactly he did this, or even how he could have done this, is an open-ended question. But if you're looking for an idea, look at Mosa. The character of Mosa and his conversation with Loki does feel a bit manipulative. Mosa shared a moment with Loki which he described as true fear. He says, "Even now, when I think about it, I can't stop trembling." And Loki's response is, "If I was there in your stead, I'd have turned that place into ruin and slaughtered the lot of them." I suppose this is more of a nuanced conversation than I was anticipating when I began this point, but by showing Loki your fear and the consequences of that fear, you are effectively teaching him to be strong and seek solutions to your problem. You can basically frame the conversation in such a way of like, "Oh look, little old weak me, and now I'm suffering because of it." So Loki can learn from you and decide, "I don't want to be like you, so I won't make the same decisions that you make. You're pathetic." Very high-level manipulation, but as a hypothetical example, it serves its purpose. Full disclosure, voice recognition or not, I do believe there is a legitimate chance that Mosa is Jarl. Hell, even Mosa's Mushi looks a lot like Jarl. The name he's given in the Viz translations is Shaggy, because the translation is basically hairy, which at this point fits Jarl best, I'm just saying. Beard for days. Loki even states that they have been friends for a very long time. Just how long, we don't know. You may ask, well, what's the point of Jarl talking to Loki today? King Harald is already dead. That's true, but his ideology is not. If Jarl fears the country of Elbaf being open, then Loki may still be needed. Essentially, it is Loki who Jarl desires to become Elbaf's next king. And even the specifics of their conversation could possibly relate. Mosa describes a moment of true fear, and Loki hints that Mosa must have had some enemies. These enemies could be the entire country of Elbaf, and the moment of fear is the possibility of them discovering what actually happened to King Harald. Loki's advice is to kill them all, to which Mosa does not really want to do. If Mosa is Jarl, then you would understand why. So with this in mind, it may be important to explain that it is actually Elder Jarul who points out that the Nika prophecy has two interpretations. Nika could be a savior, or also could be a god of destruction. Elder Jarl also uses this to explain or justify Loki's misdeeds. He tells everyone Loki was the same. I believe his motive for Harald's murder was his attempt to follow in Nika's footsteps, which might be something that Jarl himself is very familiar with from his own life. We learn from the giants that every giant dreams of becoming Nika. Jarl and Jarl were probably the same in the past. Remember, we've already speculated that Jarl and Jarl greatly contributed to the reputation of Elbaf, the giants of Elbaf, as savages. Jarl himself may have justified these actions as him attempting to become Nika. That's why it's okay. The reality is that whether or not Nika is a savior or a god of destruction, the giants of Elbaf will worship him, making them very similar to the Shandians in Noland and Kalgara's flashback. In many cultures throughout time, it is simply accepted that gods are also to be feared, because either way, Nika's appearance is foretold, and he will change the world for the better. But yeah, Elder Jarl justifying Loki's actions as him attempting to become Nika did not go well with the other giants. Nothing can justify what he did, Elder. I feel as though this is precisely what Elder Jarl may be fighting. This culture of weakness, and it would also explain his desire to fight it. This culture may prevent the arrival of Nika. What is happening can actually be perceived as sacrilegious. The giants of Elbaf are now enemies with their very own god. That interpretation of the texts exists. All of this may also relate to the significance of horns in Elbaf. We learned in chapter 1137 that horns signify an ancient, giant warrior bloodline. It could also be true that there is a belief in Elbaf that somebody with horns is destined to become the sun god and will be the one to destroy the world. Or at least this is a common interpretation. At the very beginning of this arc, when Road decides to cosplay as the sun god, he wears a horned skull. It creates the impression that Road may associate being the sun god with an appearance like that. This may also explain why Chopper was the only Straw Hat who did not make it inside the diorama. Chopper has horns. And maybe also worth reminding you that a similar skull is present on the figurehead of Hyruden's ship. Either way, it feels natural to assume that the giants of Elbaf believe, or once believed, that if Nika were to arise from among them, they would have ancient giant blood, because that also signified strength. So King Harald removing his own horns and denouncing ancient giant blood was probably a big deal. And it also makes me wonder whether Elder Jarul genuinely believes that Loki either is or could be the sun god. Because I think that Loki has a lot of ancient giant blood. We will find out that he is significantly larger than all of the other giants, and he has real horns. As Jarl is pointing out to the other giants that Loki may be following in the footsteps of Nika, there's potentially hidden motivation and manipulation. He wants them to see the possibility that Loki is Nika, and as their god, influence them, which could recontextualize the conversations that Mosa is having with Loki. If Loki is actually the sun god, then he is the god of all of the people of Elbaf, meaning to speak with him would be convening with God. So Mosa may have been asking God for advice, which is something that a lot of people do. So the specifics of this will be difficult to tackle, but I will try my best. In general, it may be best to just go with my gut, and just remind you that there are other ways to interpret this depending on what you believe or what you think makes the most sense. But the central detail within all of this is this sword which is currently in Jarl's head. You can look at the portrait of King Harald within the castle, look at the sword that he is gripping, and look at the sword in Jarl's head. The cross guards are the same or very similar. So Jarl was shanked by King Harald's sword. We are going to work backwards with this observation in mind. So, without further ado, let me paint you guys a picture. Elder Jarl is Mosa, and Mosa has been secretly communicating with Loki for years, even before King Harald died. Just as we see evidence in the most recent chapters, Mosa talks to Loki and looks for advice, because Mosa believes that Loki is the sun god. So perhaps in non-specific terms, Jarl communicated to Loki his fears concerning the country of Elbaf, and Loki's advice then is the same as Loki's advice today. If you have enemies who cause you fear, you should kill them. To Jarl, this is the word of God, and I believe that it is possible that one day he found the strength to do it. But Elder Jarl is also a man of prophecy, and a prophecy exists that King Harald's son is supposed to kill him. So in Elder Jarl's mind, his god was ordering him to plot King Harald's death and convince him to become the executioner. But making this a reality was undoubtedly a challenge. The most significant of all of this is that most of Elbaf already believed King Harald to be the sun god. So in order for this to work, Jarl may have had to undermine King Harald's authority and reputation. While King Harald was beloved by most of Elbaf, the people who disagreed with him most were most probably the warriors of Elbaf, current and former. So I imagine that these were the people that Jarl targeted first. And in general, the simplest way to frame this idea is that Jarl's goal was to convince them that King Harald was not the sun god, and that Loki could be. The purpose of this is to eventually set up the transfer of power from Harald to Loki. For Loki to be king, he needed followers. The specifics of this is up to Oda's imagination, but in my opinion, the most effective tactic is to simply give your fears to everybody else. You fear the country of Elbaf being open. Invaders are not to be trusted. If I was plotting this, I personally would be looking to invite invaders. More on this later. Either way, I think that Jarl was eventually successful in his task. Loki was running around causing chaos, and there was lots of reasons to doubt King Harald as the sun god. Yet nothing happened. The way that I choose to interpret this, the way that it makes sense to me, is Jarl was hopeful that by doing all of this that Loki would just attack the king, and he would do so with an army of fellow giants, celebrating him as their leader. But years passed and that never happened. On one hand, Elbaf's belief in Harald was too strong, and on the other hand, I think ironically, Jarl was fooled by Loki. Just my opinion, but Loki is not the god of destruction as evil as he claims himself to be. I don't think Loki wanted to kill his father. I think that he needed a genuine reason to do that. So eventually Elder Jarl got desperate and had an idea. The nail in King Harald's coffin, so to speak. The giants' belief in King Harald centered around their belief in his honesty, the honesty of who he was as a person and his ideals. So here's the crazy conspiracy. I think that Elder Jarl set up the characters and circumstances of that day. The 100 guards present were giants that Elder Jarl believed were partial to his cause and would most quickly turn against the king. Jarl also set it up that Loki would have an opportunity to arrive and fulfill his destiny. Guys, I do not think that King Harald attacked Jarl. I don't think that Loki attacked Jarl. I don't think any of the giants there attacked Jarl. My conspiracy is that Jarl took King Harald's sword and impaled himself for the purpose of framing King Harald for his murder and to smear him as a liar. I think that Jarl's plan both succeeded and failed. It is completely up to you whether Jarl actually impaled himself with King Harald's sword or in some way faked it. But either way you stand on this, I think that there's something that needs to be discussed. Norsemen from actual history dreamed of dying in battle. The Norse believed that those who died heroically in combat would be taken by Valkyries to Valhalla, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok. Dying in battle was the pathway to Valhalla. It's possible that Jarl couldn't actually choose to kill himself, but if you dig a little bit deeper, you find a different interpretation. The Norse beliefs on suicide is complex. Generally, as you would expect, there was a stigma against suicide. This was not an honorable death and would not lead to Valhalla or heaven, but voluntary death by sacrifice, especially when done for religious or communal purposes, was viewed differently. There are accounts of voluntary human sacrifices in Norse rituals where the individual might be seen as gaining honor or a special place in the afterlife. We frame this argument in such a way that Jarl is motivated for religious reasons, and I think that it should also not be forgotten that Jarl is a 400-year-old giant who gleefully pursued battle his entire life and would have accepted death at any point in time, but it never came. So Jarl might also be seen as a person looking for an appropriate way to die, which the New Age Elbaf philosophies have kind of prevented, because now there are no wars. So Jarl desired an honorable death, which is undoubtedly true because after Big Mom killed Jarl, Jarl lamented the way that Jarl died. Also at the same time, all of this should remind you of Kaido. I haven't mentioned this in the video at all, but King Harald looks a lot like Kaido. And all of this seems interrelated with Kaido's philosophies. Probably not a coincidence that Kaido is an Oni, and the giants possess ancient giant Oni blood. But yeah, I suppose this is a very long way of saying that I actually do believe that Jarl intended to die, and that obviously did not pan out. You would also think that Jarl intended for the giants to rally behind Loki and declare him their king and their god. That didn't happen either. So look man, I can only speculate so hard. I do not have the answers, but it could be that even after Jarl's death, the guards still chose to side with King Harald. Maybe the only person that was moved to turn against the king was Loki. So Loki did in fact kill all of the guards and then King Harald. Because of Jarl's trick, Loki was finally convinced to fulfill his destiny. And with everyone there present dead, nobody was alive who remembered what started it, which potentially also relates back to Dori and Brogi. The reason we fight is long forgotten, so they found Elder Jarl later, sword in hand, and assumed he was another casualty of Loki. And for whatever reason, Loki never decided to share the truth. Or even if he did, they didn't believe him. Just another trick of Loki. But yeah, with the sword in Jarl's head, there's like a legitimate question as to whether he remembers any of this. The brain damage is real. And this would be an absolutely incredible parallel to Big Mom, because if you recall, after Big Mom killed Jarl, she couldn't ever remember doing it, which would be a level of irony that is just painful. But like I said guys, this is simply my conspiracy. You're welcome. In fact, I encourage you to interpret this in a way that you like best. You know, kind of like in the spirit of the Prophecies of Nika. It all can be seen in many ways, none of which may be true. But anyway guys, you are now pretty much fully aware of my theory. I just want to conclude this video with scattered thoughts that relate to this, just to fill in some gaps, odds and ends. So to begin with, I think that it's possible that all of this is inspired by Norse mythology, and specifically the crucial event in Norse mythology, the death of Balder. King Harald is very easily paralleled with Balder, and in Norse, the prophecy of Balder's death was probably the sign of the coming of Ragnarok. And the actual story of it from Norse was actually a crazy conspiracy. So Balder was the son of Odin. Odin was the king of the gods. And in the story of One Piece, I think that Odin is paralleled with Jarl. Guys, if you look at Jarl in comparison to other giants, he is a lot bigger. And from this, I think that you can assume that Elder Jarul possesses a lot of ancient giant blood. You can also look at Jarl's death. When Big Mom shook him like a baby, his horn broke, in a way which, given what we know now, might make you think that his horns were real. So I think that both Jarl and Jarl had horns. And I think that both Jarl and Jarl were princes of Elbaf, descended of the royal line. I'll save the long explanation, but I think that it is incredibly likely that Jarl, or Jarl, is King Harald's father, or Loki's grandfather, just like Odin is the father of Balder. In Norse mythology, Balder was beloved by all due to his wisdom, purity, and beauty. The general vibe fits that of King Harald. One day, Balder had foreboding dreams of his own death, which deeply troubled him. I guess you could easily imagine how this might relate to the prophecy of Harald's death at the hands of his son in One Piece. These prophetic dreams spread alarm throughout Asgard, the realm of the gods, while they did the same in Elbaf. So in order to protect Balder, his mother Frigg went around the cosmos and secured an oath from all things that they would not harm Balder. She asked fire, water, metals, stones, earth, trees, illnesses, beasts, and birds to swear they would not hurt her son. So Balder was practically invulnerable. And at this point, I think that it is a very strong guess or theory that King Harald was renowned in Elbaf for his durability. Kind of like Kaido. He became Elbaf's greatest king not by fighting people, but by being attacked and never falling. But you could imagine if this is the story of King Harald, that for some amount of time in Elbaf, it would just be some kind of sport, right? To attack him, because he would be seen as weak, given this was the country of Elbaf, a country of warriors. This same thing occurred in Norse mythology. After Frigg secured these oaths, the gods devised a game where they would throw various items at Balder, who would remain unharmed due to the promises. This became a form of entertainment in Asgard, showcasing Balder's invulnerability. I have very little doubt that this will be paralleled in the story of One Piece. But as it turns out, Frigg overlooked one little thing, the mistletoe. So long story short, Loki utilized this knowledge that Balder's weakness was the mistletoe to plot Balder's death. But it's interesting that Loki from One Piece doesn't necessarily have to be paralleled with Loki from Norse mythology, at least not entirely. Because in Norse mythology, Loki actually gave the mistletoe fashioned dart to the blind god Hoder, who was Balder's brother. So Hoder thought that his brother was invulnerable and was tricked into throwing the actual lethal weapon at Balder. So Loki didn't actually kill Balder, Hoder did. We also see in Elbaf that Loki is blindfolded and potentially blind. So he might actually represent Hoder and have been tricked into killing Balder or King Harald. Needless to say, Balder was dead, and the god's mourning is said to be immense, which also fits with King Harald in One Piece. But where this gets really interesting is that Norse mythology has a variety of interpretations and in fact straight-up conspiracy theories. There are many people, including scholars of Norse mythology, who believe that it is actually Odin who was responsible for Balder's death. Odin, if you recall, is who we're paralleling with Jarl. Essentially, the main argument is that in Norse mythology, Odin is known as the Allfather and possesses immense wisdom, often gaining knowledge through sacrifices, like hanging from Yggdrasil or giving up an eye. He is aware of the prophecies concerning Ragnarok, including the role Balder's death plays in those events. So some argue that Odin might have seen Balder's death as necessary for the cycle of destruction and renewal that Ragnarok represents. Odin, aware of these prophecies, might have seen Balder's death as an unavoidable part of destiny, and potentially even facilitated it to ensure this cycle continues as it should. All of this should remind you of the entire video before now, and our discussion about Jarl. Long story short is that Loki might have been ordered or tricked into killing Balder by Odin, or Jarl. This is actual Norse mythology. I also think that you should not overlook the fact that in Norse, Odin is associated with sacrifice. He makes sacrifices for gain, often in the pursuit of fulfilling the world's destiny. So it's perhaps interesting that the wolf Fenrir, who is a son of Loki in Norse, grows to monstrous proportion and eventually breaks free of his bindings, chains, an event that Odin arranged after realizing Fenrir's threat. So while Odin arranged for Fenrir to break free of his chains, likewise Jarl might be doing the same with Loki. This is probably as good of a segue as I'm going to get. I mentioned earlier how it might be intuitive if Jarl intends to undermine King Harald's leadership and the people's belief in him as the sun god, to sort of encourage invaders, to emphasize the threats that exist to the island of Elbaf, and why being a strong warrior has value. Perhaps it could be argued that Jarl, or really anybody, thought it a good idea for the Giants of Elbaf to essentially get a wake-up call. Even today, after King Harald's passing, the Giants still are trying to emulate him. The culture he created is still alive. So maybe the solution to this problem is a little bit of destruction. Full conspiracy theory, tinfoil hats I hope are on, but I kinda wonder if Jarl had something to do with the arranged marriage between Loki and the Big Mom pirates. Before he died, Jarl literally called Big Mom a god of destruction. I think that it's likely that Jarl believes that Big Mom is a god of destruction, and it seems reasonable to me that a lot of Giants expected that the arranged marriage with Loki and the Big Mom pirates might go horribly wrong. Maybe that's what Jarl wanted to happen, although it never did. Even in present day, the God's Knights and Figurlin Shamrock are here. They have suddenly decided to recruit Loki to the God's Knights and attempt to capture and control the island of Elbaf. What made them decide this? I'm just wondering out loud whether Jarl has something to do with this. Is Jarl secretly communicating with the world government, pretending to be a traitor, in the hopes that it will lead to a battle, which will remind Elbaf of the importance of being warriors? It's also true that Figurlin Shamrock is like this close to releasing Loki from his chains, which, as we discussed just a moment ago, Odin was sort of responsible for orchestrating something similar in Norse mythology. This also works well with other theories that I have seen about what potentially happened the day that King Harald died. Basically, the theory is that the world government was involved in some way, that they might have desired the legendary fruit that exists within Elbaf. And some theories even go so far as to suggest that this fruit might actually have been the Gomu Gomu no Mi, because King Harald's death occurred 14 years ago, which is close enough to where Shanks probably acquired the Gomu Gomu no Mi. After the time skip, Luffy is 19 years old. He was around 5 years old when he ate the Gomu Gomu no Mi. 19 minus 5. You guessed it, is 14. So this theory that Jarl was inviting invaders to the country of Elbaf works well with other theories out there. Kind of like Mosa and the Dinenmushi. Jarl has been talking to people and been betraying the country of Elbaf for over a decade. And I suppose the final tinfoil theory is that it is actually Jarl who is responsible for the sleeping mist, and is the one that orchestrated the Strat's capture. I find it intriguing that the humans in the land of the dead wear gas masks. The stated reason that they do this is because their own smell is so putrid, because they need to smell that bad in order to not be eaten by the various creatures in the mountains. But you have to admit that a gas mask would be pretty useful if you intended on spreading sleeping gas. We see with Road in the diorama that the Giants of Elbaf actually have technology which allows them to utilize the sleeping gas. It isn't just a phenomenon which surrounds the island of Elbaf. He has the gas in a syringe and used it to keep the Strahats asleep so that he could fashion them clothes and put them in the diorama. What we know for a fact is that Elder Jarl is in fact the authority on invaders. We learned this from the giants Gerd and Goldberg. They told us that they report all invaders to Elder Jarl. We also know that the arrival of the Strahats was anticipated, and that the giants in the Great Eric were, I guess, very much caught off guard by the sleeping mists. They weren't anticipating that to be a problem. So my conspiracy theory is that Jarl has a relationship with the humans in the land of the dead. They are his slaves. I also just wonder whether Elder Jarl is also friends with the beasts in the land of the dead, the same as Loki. Like, I know it's hard to imagine this, but at one point in time, Jarl was a young man who, like all the other giants of Elbaf, dreamed of one day becoming the sun god, and likely related events in his life to the various prophecies. If befriending creatures is part of the prophecies which justifies Loki as the sun god, it may also be true for Jarl. So Jarl instructed the humans to spread sleeping gas and ensnare the Great Eric while they were all in a drunken stupor, something which has happened before, but doesn't always happen. It was Jarl who ordered the crow to snatch the Thousand Sunny. Remember, Road did not order the crow to do that. The crow seemingly did it on its own, but maybe not. The purpose of this could be multifaceted. If the Strats are actually weak, well, now they're just in prison and nobody knows where they are. If they're cowards, they may now fear Elbaf and decide to leave. And if they're strong, now they might be mad and hold a grudge against the giants of Elbaf. It also potentially positions them to have the opportunity of meeting Loki and freeing him. It just so happens that the prison and Loki are both in the land of the dead. And with this in mind, this line from Jarl to Straw Hat Luffy is potentially a little bit ominous. Jarl says it's rare for humans to make it all the way to the Sun Realm. Most confuse the underworld for Elbaf proper and flee before they find their way up here. Maybe that was the goal. Anyway guys, I know that we got a little bit unfocused there at the end. I just wanted to be thorough, but I hope that you enjoyed the ideas that we presented in this video. Odin often parallels events in singular chapters in order to relate them in ways that are not obvious. In chapter 1137, at the beginning of the chapter, we are introduced to the scene of the crime or the battle that led to the death of King Harold, who was a supposed pacifist king. And then at the end of the chapter, it's almost like a reenactment of that battle with Loki, who can't fight back because he is chained. Likewise, I kind of wonder whether it is intentional that the beginning of the chapter focused on the death of King Harold, and that the end of the same chapter wanted to remind us of the savage warriors of Elbaf who once dominated the New World, Jarl and Jarl. So regardless of this theory and what eventually happens in the story of One Piece, I think that it is a good idea. I think that it is justified that we keep our eyes on Jarl. He may be more important than you realize. Either way, I hope that you enjoyed the theory, and at the very least, it gave you something to think about. As always, guys, I'm curious as to what you guys think. Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. If you're interested, check out my book, The Booms. Link is in the description. Like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified to join the squad. And as always, guys, have a wonderful day.